After that talk, I think we have to get together people here in Israel and talk with you because you are ideal, though in some cases we have problems with some of the things. But I think there's been so much cooperation over the years between the U.S. and Israel. It would be fantastic if people here could get together again with the USDA and talk about with our abilities to interact with the U.S. and the U.S. interact with Africa and build some sort of programs where we also would interact with you. And this is, I think, one of our dreams. And so thank you for your tremendous talk today. Our next speaker is Phil Pardey. Phil is in the USA, but when we hear him talk, we're going to find out that he's really not an American. He's an Australian. And he got to the U.S. and he's working in a field which at first I didn't understand, what its importance was in food security. But here we're talking about economics, and Phil, I think, is an economist. And the last meeting that we had here that was sponsored by the Manna, we dealt with biofuels at that point, and we had an economist from the Iowa State University. And after talking and hearing about the problems and the questions of looking at things at an economic viewpoint, it changed my whole way of thinking that the interactions here are so important. We have to understand every decision we make and everything that we do, it has economic effects. And so one has to look at the economy of these, of what's happening. Hey, we have to make decisions. We all got great ideas. And we all have marvelous programs. But you have to decide what it makes economic sense, and then we have to have the policymakers who are then going to say, okay, you've come down to this and this and this, and we're going to push forward. But the economist has to be the one who brings them really, I think, some of it, because money is a big part of it, and people have to understand what the economic consequences. So Phil I've got a page that's just way too long here. Phil is one of the world's leaders in economics concerned with agriculture. And rather than go through all of his tremendous contributions in the areas that he's been working at, I just want to have him come up, and when he tells you what's going on, and also probably one of the important things also that he's working with the various organizations that are having to do with food security. And the Bill Gates, Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation has been putting a tremendous amount of money into food security. They see that this is something that, like all of us at a certain age in our development, we say, okay, I've done for myself, now what can I do for others? But they need people who know how to tell them what to do and why to do it and what's economically feasible. And Phil is one of those people who goes in there and is one of the big advisors trying to get order into this and decide where money should go and what are the programs to do. So Phil. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bernard. I predicted at dinner last night to Harris that it'd be a very hard act to follow, and my prediction was very accurate. That was a great talk, but a nice introduction to my remarks this morning, and I'd like to thank the folks here, Bernard, for introducing me, Danny for having me back. Adina was my host here 6 years ago, I guess, and we were running all around Israel with a bunch of wheat breeders and pathologists looking for weedy relatives of wheat plants, and every time we got out of the bus it poured with rain. So my vision of Israel is this rain-soaked country, and it's yet to be disabused. But I come from down under, and I know the facts, and the statistics suggest otherwise. So I'm going to try and sort of give you a bird's eye view of our current take on what we think is going on with respect to agricultural production, productivity and R&D. And this is work done by colleagues at myself and others at the University of Minnesota. But as Bernard mentioned, we're also working in a joint project with IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., where I used to live, to not tell Bill and Melinda Gates what to do, but to try and get a more evidence-based approach to their decision-making processes. So they, like many other agencies, including the USDA, on the margin are cash-strapped. I mean, there's always a trade-off on the margin, and so there lies a role for economists in terms of how to develop information and input into decisions where there's a trade-off to be made. And as will be evident, a lot of what we're doing is trying to bring into play a lot of the things I think Harris was reporting about, and that is that agriculture is an extremely unique production process, that it's heavily dependent on natural inputs. Most of them are unmeasured quantitatively, and most of them are unpriced. But nonetheless, they're intrinsically important to that production system, and so to the extent that we reflect those in our understanding of the sort of global pressures with respect to productivity change or not, I think we're going to make some big mistakes about what the potential future is going to be like by not looking carefully back at the past. So I'm going to give you a sense of what we think is some non-trivial shifts in the structure of production agriculture and the productivity associated with that through this sort of lens of natural inputs, which means we're going to be in some of the slides I've got, very spatially explicit about agricultural production processes, and hopefully you'll see this as we go through. Just an indication of the scale of where we've come. A lot of slides you see with respect to ag production and productivity begin in 1961, because that's when FAO start reporting their data. And we've been working to try and push data sets back earlier than that, because as will hopefully be evident from my remarks, I think we need to take a much longer run perspective than is typical in thinking about these issues when trying to understand these big long run productivity changes and the role that R&D has in shifting production and productivity. So here's our estimates of global production for these 15 major field crops dating back to 1908, not 1961. These are in constant 2005 prices. And our estimates are that the world produced just $82 billion worth of output for these 15 crops back in 1908. And we now produce nearly $500 billion worth of output. But what you can see is a huge spatial shift in where that production takes place. So back in the 1930s, Asia accounted for around 18% of global production. Europe accounted for over half. Europe, etc., includes the New World. And so that's shifted now. And so we now have Asia producing 43% of that global output. Africa still has a comparatively small share, but nonetheless doubled its share of global production. And the European, etc., share has dropped to 26%. So just bear in mind this notion of where agriculture takes place, I think, has a big impact in thinking about the future of agricultural production globally. I think it was mentioned yesterday, there was varying numbers, but the number I recall is about 38% of the world's ice-free land mass is in agriculture. So if you take a sort of biological perspective, agriculture is this very physically pervasive, spatially encompassing sector. If you look at it through an economic lens, you get a very different view of the world. And what I've done is I've taken the 250-something crops that are in the FAO statistics and valued them up for each country, and then arrayed the countries from the largest producer on the left to the smallest producer on the right, and expressed their share of global production. And what you get is a very interesting view of the world. That if you take the top 5 countries, / regions, because I've got the former Soviet Union there, but if you take China, US, India, former Soviet Union and Brazil, you have almost 55% of the entire world's agricultural production in those 5 countries. It's a highly spatially concentrated production system from an economic perspective, as opposed to a very pervasive, spatially pervasive production system through a physical perspective. And if you look crop by crop by crop, if you take the top 10 crops and do the same sort of exercise, array them from the largest to the smallest producer, it turns out that the top 10 producing countries for the top a dozen crops or so produce somewhere between 70 and 90% of the world's total production. So it's even more spatially concentrated when you get down to a crop sense. And so the implications for that in terms of vulnerability or not to climate change, policy change and so forth, and its implications when you add it up to think about global food supplies, is just worth bearing in mind. So we think of this canvas as being very broad, but when you get down to its economic roots, it's very narrow in terms of its spatial production. In our efforts to push these long-run data back, these are all data, most of this data is not yet published, so it's in process, so you're amongst the first to see it. Trying to get a longer-run view of productivity measures. And to an economist, productivity is simply a measure of output relative to input, right? So it's not production. Production is just a measure of output. But what we're trying to do is relate the levels and amounts of output relative to inputs. And so this is one of the simplest productivity measures you can get. It's the output of a particular crop relative to the area in which that crop's grown. And so this is global average yield trends for over 100 years. And you can see that there was a period here where they were bouncing around because of weather events and so forth, but not much movement in terms of the rates of growth. And in fact, across the three major food staples, none of these crops from 1920 to 1960 recorded an average annual rate of growth that exceeded 1% per annum. Most of them were much lower than that, so 0.69% per annum for maize and less than 0.5% per annum for rice. Something happened around the 1960s, the Green Revolution and other sorts of activities, and so we got this big bump in the rates of growth of these commodities, often a doubling, if not a trebling, in the rate of growth of these crops per year. And that, when I talk to policymakers, lots of people think that's what's still going on, but in fact that's not what's still going on. Something's happened. There's a structural shift going on. We started writing about this 4 or 5 years ago, and we're fairly tentative about it because it's very hard to sort of disentangle a trend from a blip in the data. But as the data unfolds, it looks like these structural shifts are real. And what we see here in the red indicates a non-trivial, statistically significant slowdown in the rates of yield growth, which is a productivity measure, post-1990. And the results are quite robust. You can get endpoint sensitivities to this, but if you split it in the late 80s or the early 90s, the trend is there. And it's not saying that every country is experiencing a slowdown, but overall, this is our global rates of growth. There's a slowdown, with one very important exception, and that's corn. Interestingly, that's one commodity that's had the most private sector attention probably over the last 30 or 40 years. And has been able to maintain its rates of productivity growth, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on and give you a better sense of what might be going on with respect to maize or corn. So, in these productivity measures, something's happening. What about other productivity measures? Here's a more pervasive measure of productivity. So this is a measure of not just the output of a particular crop relative to a particular input like land or labour, but this is all agricultural output for countries of the world relative to our measured views of land inputs and labour inputs. I'm sure the slides will be available and you can go through this at your leisure, but what it's pointing out is the same sort of pattern is happening with respect to these broader measures of land and labour productivity, that pre and post 1990 you're getting a slowdown. It gets masked a bit if you include China. If you can remember back to that earlier slide, China was sitting up there always as number one or number two producer in most of these crops. And China is the exception in terms of the productivity story in the world. And I'll tell you why in a little bit. But they've been able to maintain a productivity growth, and they're sort of the outlier in the data. But if you take them out of these data, you get a fairly uniform slowdown in productivity growth. And most notably, this is the 22 countries that produce 80% of the world's output. And this is the 158 countries that produce the rest. And if you look across the bottom here, these producers here, this is the difference between the pre and the post-1990 growth rates. They're both slowing down. So if you look at the smaller producers like we worry about for the Gates Foundation and others, there's a tendency for a substantial slowdown in productivity growth in those parts of the world. These are, in the jargon of economists, these are partial measures of productivity. So they're output, whether it's a particular crop or all output with respect to a particular input. But it doesn't get you a sort of comprehensive handle on the broader aspects of productivity, because you can increase growth rates of yields by using more fertiliser, for example. So what if we tried to add the use of fertiliser and machinery and energy and seed and so forth in our denominators, so we get a measure of the totality of output relative to our measured totality of inputs. And I'm very careful here in saying our measured totality of inputs because we don't include rainfall and sunlight and temperature and things like that in those measures, which have an output consequence. And here's an effort we've had underway for some time at Minnesota to develop a very comprehensive set of input measures where we adjust for quality change in labour and capital and things of that nature. So there's been very big improvements in the quality of labour and capital and so forth in US agriculture. And even if we do that, we get this very disturbing set of results. And that is that from the Second World War, from 1949, I'm sorry, the slide label up the top should be 1949 to 2007. From 1949 to 1990, multi-factor productivity growth rate, that is output with respect to all of these measured inputs, was growing at just over 2% per annum. Post-1990, that's dropped to just over 1% per annum, so it's 1.2% per annum. And it turns, so that's nearly a halving in the multi-factor productivity growth rate. And if you understand the laws of compounding, if that trend persists for the next 10, 20 or 30 years, that's going to have huge implications in terms of global production with this much lower productivity growth rate in the US, particularly as the US is such a dominant producer in most of the key crops grown around the world. Turns out 44 of the 48 states in the US, it's not just a couple of large states driving this, it's a very pervasive shift, structural shift in productivity. We're working on the thing that really worries me is we're working on a paper we haven't quite finished up yet, but we have actually measured, have a measure of MFP back to 1910, and the period that we've all grown up in is ahistorical in terms of its rates of productivity growth. There was a period in the 1960s and the 1970s where you had these very high 2% per annum rates of growth, and we can't replicate that in the measured history of US agriculture. So not only have we got a slowdown, it may be that we're reverting to a much longer run average rate of growth, and if that's true in the US, it may be true in other parts of the world. I know it's true in Australia, where there's pretty good measures of productivity, and certain parts of countries in Europe where we've got better measures of productivity. So something's going on. And what is that something? One of the things is, where does this productivity come from? So in the early economics, technical change was, in the jargon of economics, manna from heaven. Economists didn't actually have models to explain how productivity and technical change, it just fell out of the sky. And actually, Zvi Grilicus in the 1950s was spearheaded sort of economists getting their head around where does this productivity growth come from. And one of the big drivers, not the only driver by any means, is technical change. Causes productivity growth, and one of the big drivers of technical change is R&D. So I'm going to give you a few numbers on some new data on global R&D trends, but before I do that I want to sensitise you to what that relationship's like. And it turns out this is a slide of an economist's view about this sort of research productivity relationship, where we incur a set of costs in R&D, often for a period of time where there's actually no benefits from that R&D. We haven't even developed a new wheat variety or whatever, and so there's no benefits. And then once we release that variety and commercialise it, there's a diffusion process where it takes some time for farmers to pick up that variety. It peaks in its use and then gets supplanted by another variety. So there's a stream of benefits associated with that stream of costs, but it takes a substantial period of time for that process to play its hand out. It turns out that we get what we call a present value of that set of benefits and juxtaposed against the present value of the costs, and we end up with very high estimated rates of return. So for the amount of dollars we spend, we get very high rates of return on average. It doesn't mean all research pays, but on average, research is a highly profitable investment, both from a private perspective, but particularly from a social perspective. Once you develop a commercialisable technology, it still doesn't, as you saw in the previous slide, have an immediate impact. It takes time for that technology to diffuse out over the landscape. And here's some data a graduate student of mine, Jason Beddoe, put together. He just defended his thesis a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to give you a couple of slides from his thesis, which I think are really stunning and causing me to rethink agriculture and agricultural productivity growth. But here's an estimate, even in the US, where you think all the institutions work and there's very aggressive private sector participation in markets and so forth. This is over time, this is the share of the corn acreage that's sort of planted to hybrid corn or that's using fertiliser. So in fact, up until the 1950s, less than half the US corn acreage was getting any chemical fertiliser. and it's now up to a substantial figure, and so forth, irrigation, insecticide use, and so forth. So it turns out, from the date of commercialisation to the date at when 80% of the corn acreage was using its peak level of those technologies, these are the timelines that it takes to diffuse those technologies out over the landscape in the US, not in sub-Saharan Africa, where we're spending most of my time working now. These are decadal. So it's not that you can turn on the spigot and suddenly you're going to get a productivity response. It takes a long way to play its hand out. And this is ignoring all of the R&D time that goes into developing the technology, and increasingly now regulatory restraints that add another hurdle to getting modern biotechnologies out in the field. So when Zvi did his work in 1950s, he did a fancy bit of econometrics, which was fancy for its day, and he thought that the lag was 5 years from when you spend R&D dollars to when it realises its productivity consequences. We now just released some work on the US where we think the lag is 50 years long. That's what the data's telling us. It doesn't mean you wait 50 years to have an impact, but it takes 50 years from when you start spending dollars on research to realising its productivity consequences. So if you think going forward, what's going to happen in global food supplies, in a sense the die's already cast, right? But nonetheless, if we, as you'll see, if we don't change what we're doing, I've just shown you the evidence suggests we're already on a glide path that's slowing down the rate of productivity growth. If we need to turn that around, we're going to have to ramp up investments in R&D, but you're not going to turn that productivity trajectory around instantaneously. It's going to take some time. How do economists see this R&D having an impact? The obvious and direct benefit is that it reduces increasing productivity, means you get more output for the same input. It lowers the per unit costs of production for those farmers who adopt those technologies, and not all farms adopt those technologies at the same time. So it's only if you're using the technologies do farmers realise the benefit. And that's the direct benefit that most people think of. But productivity has another benefit. It has an indirect effect with respect to impacting prices of commodities. And that's a two-edged sword. That obviously as commodity prices are lowered, then all of us as consumers gain because we get better quality and larger amounts of consumption for a given price. But it's a two-edged sword in the sense that it lowers the returns to farmers because they're getting lower revenue streams, but their costs of production have been lowered as well. And so there's a dance there as to how quickly they're lowering their costs of production relative to its impact on commodity prices. So it doesn't eliminate, but it certainly reduces the benefits to farmers. The price effect reduces the benefits to farmers who adopt. But importantly, it's a cost to farmers who do not adopt. And if you think about the political economy of R&D and technical change and so forth, that plays its hand out there. So the net benefits to farm firms depends on whether or not they adopt technologies and to how effective those technologies are on their farm. But as I say, overall, adding those direct and indirect benefits together, the evidence is that society has benefited substantially from this. So what's been happening, as best we know it, with respect to R&D investments globally? Here's my current best estimates of where we were in 1970 and where we were in 2005 globally for all public food and ag R&D spending worldwide. You can see the US has lost some market share. It used to be 18% so it's certainly still the elephant in the room. It was 18% back in 1970. It's lost some market share. And in Harris's slide, he had a pie diagram map there with other. And ag R&D is a part of the slice of that other. There's other stuff going on there. So that small slice, I mean, I'm watching this farm bill negotiation very carefully, is potentially vulnerable to across-the-board budget cuts. If there was a 20% across-the-board cut, that would have a massive impact on global food and ag R&D spending. But interestingly, where this research takes place is shifting. So back in the 1970s, the developing world, or today's developing world as a whole, accounted for about 40% of global public ag R&D spending. It's now inching up. We've nearly finished some numbers for 2007, so it's about half of all public ag R&D spending. And it turns out that three countries, Brazil, China and India, account for something like half of that total public ag R&D spending in the developing world. So the spatial concentration of where these innovations come from in agriculture is highly circumscribed, just like production is, which is not, those two ideas are not unrelated. So anyway, just whilst lots of countries also engage in agricultural R&D, it's highly spatially concentrated. But what's been happening, so that big jump from 1970 to 2005, there's a substantial increase, is masking this ratcheting down in the rate of growth of ag R&D spending, and that process has been in play for some time. You can see here these are measuring in real terms, so we've sort of flushed out the effects of inflation. The low and middle income countries back in the 1970s were growing in real terms at over 6% per annum. So there was a massive ramping up in the sort of green revolution period of time of institutional development and investments in R&D and so forth. But that's dropped there down to 2%. And look at the high income countries, which includes the US and Israel, over around 2.5% and down now to barely 1% per annum. That's really worrying. And if you think about these long-run processes playing their hands out, it turns out that we've been ratcheting down this rate of spending for some time, and that feeds its hand eventually through into the rates of growth of productivity that we're now seeing. And those two ideas, I think, are very directly related. I often hear, well, that doesn't matter, the private sector's stepping in to fill the breach. These data show that that's not true. In fact, the private sector's rate of growth has slowed, as has the public sector's rate of growth. And if you tease below these numbers, it's even more concerning than this, because when you think of private sector, people typically think of Monsanto and Pioneer DuPont and Syngenta and so forth. That's actually not representative of what most of that private sector food and ag R&D spending is. You should be thinking of General Mills and those sorts of institutions, because 2/3 of that spending has got nothing to do with farm productivity. It's post-farm food processing, handling and things of that nature. And if you think where, the economist adage of follow the money, most of the value added in terms of the retail price of food is post-farm, not on-farm, and that's where the rents from innovation can be captured in terms of that part of the market segment. So there's a very substantial shift in the structure of the portfolio of private ag R&D. It's heavily oriented to post-farm research, and it's been slowing.
Very quick comment. That middle segment, or that these processes invest very little in money.
Sorry,
these processes, post-farm processes invest very little in money.
No, the evidence is that about 2/3 of the total food and ag R&D spending is in processing types of technologies. Oh no, exactly. So then that doesn't feed back, and that's my point. That's not having an impact at the farm level. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, it has implications for farmers, but it doesn't have a direct impact on farm productivity. Correct. Yep. You'd expect large countries to spend comparatively more on ag R&D than small countries. So one of the ways we get a handle on that is to develop what we call intensity ratio. So that means relative to the value of your output, how intensively are you investing in R&D? So if you go to Bill Gates and his competitors, they're putting $20 to $30 for every $100 of sales into R&D. They're highly intensive in their research investments. You can see here that this is public sector spending. In agriculture in the high income countries, they're spending nearly $3 on R&D for every $100 of output, which is a very substantial increase over this period of time. So in the developed world, agriculture has become much more knowledge intensive. In the developing world, it's hardly budged. That's partly due to the fact that, in fact, agricultural output in the developing world has been expanding faster than it has in the developed world. So although they've been ramping up their investments in R&D, because they now have a larger share of the global pie, they haven't been ramping them up faster than their ag sectors have been expanding. So they're basically more or less treading water in terms of the intensity of their investments. So they haven't moved to a point where they're ratcheting up the intensity of investments. And if you factor in the private sector, as best we can, it's very hard to get numbers there, but most of this private ag R&D research takes place in the developed world. Very little of it takes place in the developing world. So combined, we're talking about $5.50 of public and private ag R&D for every $100 of output. So agriculture I think, has a public perception of being sort of technologically backward. In fact, it's not. It's actually sitting very squarely in terms of the mid, if you look at sort of intensities across sectors, it's sort of in the mid-range of the intensity of investment and activity in innovation systems. Tracking over time, what's been happening with respect to public and private ag R&D spending. You can see across the OECD countries a generally upward trend. And with apologies here, the Israeli numbers are not as great as I'd like them, so I pulled out the best I could do. And my estimates are that, and I just have some numbers here from the OECD. We can have a chat about trying to improve these numbers after the talk.
Much lower.
It's much lower than that. So this is the this is the intensity of investment in the public sector of Israeli ag R&D systems. So by my estimates, you're sitting about middle of the pack with respect to OECD countries, of which you're now a member, of your intensity of investment in R&D spending. So this rundown in US ag productivity R&D is one part of the story. And it's driven by all of these other agendas that are impinging on agriculture. So, as Harris mentioned, environmental and biodiversity demands, health, nutrition, obesity concerns, biofuels production, research oriented to distribute, not increase the pie, so income distribution concerns. And so the upshot is that all of these other agendas have come at the expense of, not in addition to, maintaining farm productivity research. So I went through, and one of my students went through, all of the projects, project by project, in the USDA land grant system, and tagged them as to whether they had anything to do with enhancing or maintaining farm productivity, as opposed to those that weren't. And this is really scary to me. What we think of with respect to ag R&D in the US now is not what ag R&D was 30 years ago, because barely 56% of that research has got anything to do with farm productivity anymore. All of these other agendas have impinged on and driven the research in these very different directions. And I'm not saying that that research doesn't have payoff and social value. My concern is that the opportunity costs of that, I think, have been ignored by policymakers. We've been systematically running down the orientation of this research to maintaining farm productivity. So it's no surprise we see the productivity story turning around in the direction that I've just put up earlier. Very interestingly, if those of you worry about price spikes, there was a big price spike back in the early 1970s. And I think policymakers got scared for a while and said, we've got to start ratcheting up farm productivity research. And the bad news is that that attention span only lasted 3 or 4 years until all of these other agendas took over and reasserted themselves in running down the orientation of R&D spending. So a couple of final slides here. I would like to hope that we could turn this around, although whether there's going to be suddenly a big dollop of money coming into ag R&D out of this new farm bill would be a great outcome. I did some maths. So if we eliminated all the direct commodity payments and just put the breadcrumbs, 20% of that money into ag R&D, you'd double the USDA budget in terms of public sector ag R&D spending. Seems to me, as an economist, that would be a much higher social payoff than the direct commodity payments, but that's a conversation for another time. So whether you're getting more or not for ag R&D spending, we're going to have to be much smarter about how we spend these dollars going forward. And that's partly what Gates have been contracting myself and colleagues to think about. What added information can we put into these decision-making processes? And you get down to really substantive sort of questions. So, you can talk sort of in the abstract about this, but key question is how much to invest in total. I'm emphasising crops here, but the same thing happens on the livestock side. So what do you actually invest in? What are the principal constraints where, if you invested in them, are you likely to succeed? And if you succeed, what is the productivity and thereby economic consequences of that? With respect to drought tolerance, soil constraints, pests and diseases, do you do it in terms of new varieties versus crop management or chemical controls? All of these on the margin involve specific trade-offs. Key one, which we've ignored, I think, largely in our economic work, particularly up to now, and not on the biological side, is where do you invest that? So even if you're identifying a particular crop constraint, does it matter whether you're targeting your interventions here versus there? And I'll show you that it does. And then other difficult things are balancing between, okay, what do you do with respect to short versus long run objectives in R&D? Do you try and invent the technology at home, or do you beg, borrow and steal from others? I mean, that's an obvious conscious choice. The estimates that we have is that up to a third to a half of all local productivity gains are due to someone else's R&D. If that's true, there's huge value in being much more aggressive about scouting and linking and networking and adapting that technology into your local conditions. And again, what's the balance between crops versus livestock? And even if you're thinking the livestock share is going to increase, that has direct derived demand consequences for crop production in terms of feed use. So what we're doing in our Gates project is things like this. So about 15 years ago when I was working at IFPRI, I asked us what I thought was an easy question to answer. Where in the world is maize, wheat, corn, soybean and rice grown? It turns out there was no data that was geo-referenced in terms of where production and agriculture took place. So I hate to say it, but several $1 million later, and this is how much effort it took, we've now come up with views about what we call a plausible spatial distribution of area, production and yield, stratified by production systems. So we've stratified it out into high input rain-fed, low input rain-fed and irrigated systems. And we now have a measured view of where in the world these crops are grown, and we're fairly well along to having a 2005 benchmark set of data. And these are all freely available up on our Harvest Choice website down here. And what I've done is stratified, so these are on a 10 by 10 kilometre grid for the world. And I've taken each one of those pixels, and I've just shown you here what the array of yield performance of those pixels are. And you can see, first of all, within countries, so if we take the US, the physical footprint of production is very different within a country. So just using country-level data doesn't really get you down to the essence of agriculture, which is highly location-specific in terms of its performance. So very different physical footprint, but a huge difference in terms of how those pixels perform even within a country. And so what I did here was I took, so this is, the colour scheme here is at the dark end of the spectrum. This is the highest decile. These are the 10th pixels that are yielding highest in the world, and these are the 10th pixels that are yielding lowest. And I took the top 3 deciles and said, where in the world do you find those pixels? So it turns out that the US alone constitutes 1/3 of the highest yielding pixels for maize. It constitutes 28% of the highest yielding pixels for wheat, and about 1/4 of the highest yielding pixels for soybean. Is not up there with respect to rice, obviously. It has some. It doesn't dominate the world. This is an interesting, so obviously doing a lot of work in Africa here, and I was out of interest compared that with Australia, and it turns out that Australia has a smaller share of higher yielding pixels than sub-Saharan Africa with respect to these 4 crops, by and large. And we can go into a whole conversation over lunch, if you like, about that Australian agriculture, by and large, despite 10 years of drought and so forth, is reasonably profitable for farmers, but for many in sub-Saharan Africa, they're succeeding just on a subsistence level. So there's other stuff going on there that we haven't got time to talk about. But it's not true that Africa's a basket case necessarily. It's doing, in this measure, it's actually doing much better than Australia. This is Jason's thesis, which I think is a breakthrough thesis. What he did was, we started looking back in time and trying to think about what we call the spatial dynamics of production. So that snapshot I gave you of where agriculture is around the world in 2000 is not where it was back in 1899 and won't be where it will be in 2050. If you're thinking about global food supply and the impacts of climate change and things like that, you have to get down location, location, location. All right? It's not the average temperature or the average rainfall in the US that's relevant. It's the rainfall at where the crop's grown and the temperature at where the crop's grown. And it turns out the effective climate footprint of crop production changes as you change the location of crop production. And it turns out that agriculture moves big time over the landscape. It doesn't just stay still. It moves for all sorts of reasons, and haven't got time to go into that now, but nonetheless it moves. So what Jason did was, went back, and fortunately the US has had a really great set of data that amazingly wasn't digitised. We had to digitise this at our centre, and got county-level production data back to 1899. And what he's done is tag the counties in terms of their share of national corn production in 1899. So you can see that there's a reasonable concentration here in the Midwest, but there's a lot of greens and so forth down here in the eastern seaboard and southern states and so forth. Look what happens over the course of that period of time. A big shift in the spatial. So we've essentially flushed out all of the maize that used to be grown down here, and it's all concentrated in the upper Midwest. The US alone produces almost 40% of the entire world's corn production, and about 40% of that production takes place within about 200 miles of where I sit on a day-to-day basis. So not only do we see this big spatial concentration at a country level in production, within a country, in this one, there's this huge spatial agglomeration in production going on. Again, you can immediately jump forward and think of all of the implications of that. And it turns out it's moved nearly 750 kilometres over that period of time. So what you can do in GIS techniques is you can calculate what's called the centroid of production. It's the geographical pivot point of where this is growing. And that's what Jason did. So it turns out that geographical pivot point moved from central Illinois to southeastern Iowa. And technology clearly played a role there. It was at least an enabling role, if not a significant causal factor in that. There was lots of other things going on in terms of infrastructure and population movement and so forth. But nonetheless, it's moved. And what it does is it kicks off a whole cascade of sort of interactions between technology and location. And the biologists in the room are well aware of G by E, the genetics by environment interactions changing very dramatically. So that's one major thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about the prospects for global food production, is to think about this location movement aspect of agriculture. Wrap up here with very quick slides. What we're trying to do is also get a handle on what is the location specificity of disease pressures on crops, right? And we've been doing a lot of work on wheat rust, and if here in the US, the USDA Cereals Disease Lab is located on the St. Paul campus where I sit, and these guys have been tracking the losses attributable to stem rust for nearly a century. It turns out, up until the 1960s, this is the loss in the US from just one disease on wheat, stem rust. So in some states like Minnesota and the Dakotas, in some years, 40 to 60% of the wheat production was lost due to this one disease. The national average, it's more muted, but so 23% of the entire US wheat crop was wiped out in 1 year just due to this disease. And something happened in the 1960s, very minimal losses thereafter. And many of you in the room contributed to that in terms of breeding resistance into crops. And so a big shift in terms of pre and post 1960, and the slides will be available there, in terms of the number of states that got affected and the levels of losses that got affected. We didn't know much about where pest and disease occurrence was worldwide, so some of you might be familiar with CABI, the CABI Compendium, which is a huge agglomeration of literature about pest and disease occurrence, and they tagged which countries recorded stem rust occurrence. But the trouble is these dots don't tell you when the disease occurred. They don't tell you whether it's an acre or 100,000 acres got affected, the intensity of the disease. And the long and the short of it is we've spent the last couple of years working with CSIRO in Australia, and we're about to roll this map out in a couple of weeks' time. And we now have, again, a geo-reference view of the spatial occurrence of this particular pest and disease, not only where it's likely to occur, but where it's also likely to persist. So whilst Minnesota, for example, is highly susceptible to stem rust, what's happening now is a foot of snow's falling today. That kills off the disease. And so we've got this modelling framework, and we're working through a whole bunch of pests and diseases where we can now think about the spatial occurrence of these pests and diseases based on the phenology of the pest and disease and how it responds to climate and so forth. So, and it turns out there's big spatial variation. So it turns out in Africa, about 90% of the wheat footprint is highly supportive of stem rust. And 2/3 of that footprint, if you get it, you basically got it. All right, it's going to be there and it will be persistent. Whereas in the US, there's a substantial share of the wheat acreage that's susceptible, but only a very small share of the wheat acreage down in Texas and Louisiana does this disease persist interseasonally. That has huge differences in terms of the likelihood of occurrence of the disease and its spatial spread and so forth, which we haven't got time to get into. Final slides. Biology is important, but economics is important too. And so if you're thinking about the location of production, you also need to think about how that production matches or doesn't with respect to market access. And people yesterday were talking about market access issues in terms of the costs of getting knowledge and inputs onto farms and the costs of delivering additional output to markets. And so what we've been doing, haven't got time to go into it, but doing a lot of work in geospatial modelling here using data on topography and land use and infrastructure in terms of navigable rivers, roads and railroads and so forth, and try to estimate the time distance to market of African farmers. So if you're sitting at a particular pixel in Africa, how long does it take you to get to a market of, say, 20,000 people? and this is, the green is less than an hour, the red is greater than 10 hours. So there's a reasonable amount of green on that landscape, but you start stepping it up and go to 50,000 people, and you go to 100,000 people, and the red gets redder. In other words, getting to reasonable market sizes, large chunks of African agriculture is sitting greater than 10 hours away from a market. So that immediately circumscribes what you can do in terms of not much good getting in and, say, with a smallholder dairy production scheme with attenuated cold chains if you're sitting 10 hours away from a market of a reasonable size. So immediately you can start to segment where you might target your interventions with respect to their market relationships in conjunction with some of the other data I put up with respect to the productivity potential of the areas. So it turns out 65% of the cropland in sub-Saharan Africa is sitting more than 6 hours away from a market of 500,000 people or more. That's a major constraint for production. So, final set of remarks, and they really are on the last slide. So, there is demonstrable evidence that there's really high rates of return to ag R&D, and so what that tells me as an economist is we're persistently underinvesting in those rates. We should be ramping up those rates of investment so we push the marginal rate of return down to average out the rates of return you'd get to other sorts of investments. Lots of political impediments to doing that. The trouble is, though, we're seeing a fairly pervasive slowdown in the pattern of spending and a diminishing share of that spending directed to farm productivity research, which is showing up now in terms of a slowdown in productivity growth. And as I said, China is the outlier. It's continued to maintain a ramping up in its investments in R&D, and surprise, surprise, it's been the one country that's maintained its productivity growth rate in agriculture. So I think there's a real call for attention here and a refocus on this productivity R&D story, but I would emphasise taking a much longer run view than we have in the past for some of the reasons I hopefully have made apparent today. Thanks, Bernard.